The wind had a bite that day, carrying the last bitter dust of a sandstorm that had churned the Arizona territory for 3 days running. Elias Boone, a man carved from the same hardscrabble land he rode, hunkered low in his saddle, his eyes slits against the grit, his buckskin mare, steady as a rock through most any weather, pushed onward, hooves crunching the sparse, brittle brush of the plateau. The sky was still a bruised purple gray, but the worst of it was passing, leaving behind a world scoured clean and stark under a fading afternoon sun. Elias wasn't looking for anything in particular, just trying to make good time to the hidden spring he knew lay a half-day's ride ahead. But a man who lives out in the empty places learns to see what ain't natural, and as he guided his horse down into the jagged cut of a dry riverbed, his gaze snagged on something out of place. First, it was just a faint disturbance in the sand, a ripple that wasn't wind-made. Then, closer, undeniable, footprints, small, narrow, and bare. They shuffled, rather than walked, dragging through the fine dust, some of them smeared with a darker stain. He dismounted, leading his horse, his hand naturally dropping to the worn butt of the Schofield revolver holstered at his hip. A man out here alone, he learned long ago, asked questions with his eyes first and his gun second. The tracks led deeper into the winding wash, where the banks rose steep and riddled with shallow caves and overhangs. He found more signs, a scrap of calico cloth, faded and torn, snagged on a mesquite thorn, and then a smear of something truly unsettling, a streak of dark, dried blood on a sandstone boulder, too much to be from a mere scratch. A cold knot tightened in his gut. This wasn't a traveler, not one who was doing well. Anyhow, this was someone running, or hiding. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, each step measured, each breath held. The wind sighed through the canyon, a lonely, mournful sound. He rounded a bend, the air suddenly still and heavy, and that's when he saw her. Crouched in the meager shadow of an overhanging rock, she was barely more than a bundle of rags and bones. Her knees were drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped tight around herself, as if trying to shrink away from the world. Her hair, the color of dry straw, was matted with dust and tangled around a face that was thin to the point of gauntness, smudged with dirt and tears. Her eyes, when they finally flickered up to him, were wide and wild, like a cornered rabbit's, a desperate, hunted look that sent a jolt through him. She flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement, as if struck, and tried to press herself even further into the rock, half mad with exhaustion and fear. Elias stopped a good distance away, raising his hands slowly, palms open, to show he carried no immediate threat. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, the kind he used to soothe a skittish horse. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't speak, only stared at him, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He could see the tremble that ran through her slight frame, a constant tremor. He lowered his hands, took a step forward, then stopped again as she let out a small, choked sound, shrinking away once more. He sighed, the wind whipping a stray strand of hair across his eyes. "You look like you've been through hell and back, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "You got a name?" Her lips parted, then pressed back together. No sound came out. Instead, she shook her head almost imperceptibly, then managed a raspy whisper that barely carried on the wind. "Don't turn me in! Please, don't turn me in!" The plea was raw, desperate, cutting through the silence of the canyon. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the tattered remnants of her dress, the cuts and scrapes on her bare arms and legs, the way she clutched herself as if holding her very being together. He'd seen that look before, that deep-seated fear that gnawed a person down to nothing. It wasn't the look of a common runaway. "I ain't a lawman," he finally said, his gaze unwavering. "And I ain't got no interest in turning folks in, long as they ain't got a price on their head for murder." He paused. You got a price on your head?" She shook her head again, more emphatically this time. "No, I swear, just want to be left alone." "Well, you ain't gonna be left alone out here," he countered, gesturing to the desolate landscape. "Not for long. Anyhow, not like this. You'll die of thirst, or sun, or worse." He pushed his hat back slightly, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. "I got water and a fire. You can share my camp, if you like. No questions asked. Just a little peace to rest." She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the canteen hanging from his saddle. Then back to his face. The offer was simple, direct, and held no menace. The alternative, she likely knew, was death. Slowly, painfully. She unfolded herself from her crouch. Rising to a shaky stand, she swayed, and for a moment, he thought she would collapse. But she caught herself, her gaze still fixed on him, wary as a wild thing. "Water?" she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. He nodded, reaching for his canteen and uncorking it. He held it out, not coming closer, letting her come to him. It took a hesitant moment, but then she stumbled forward, snatched the canteen, and drank deeply, heedless of manners, the water spilling down her chin. She drank until the last drop was gone, then looked at him with something akin to dazed relief. He pointed to a sheltered nook a little further down the wash. "We'll make camp there. Fire'll keep the chill off once the sun sets." He remounted, letting her follow at her own pace, which was agonizingly slow. She trailed behind his horse, a ghost in the twilight, her silence a heavy cloak she refused to shed. He kept a quiet vigil, listening to the soft crunch of her bare feet on the sand, her labored breathing, and the frantic drumming of his own thoughts. That night, the desert air grew sharp and cold as the stars began to prick through the deepening blue. Elias had a small fire going, its flames flickering against the dark rock walls. He'd made a meager meal of hardtack and dried venison. He offered her some, and she ate slowly, deliberately, as if trying to savor each bite, though her hands still trembled. She spoke not a word, her eyes fixed on the flames, a thousand unspoken horrors reflected in their light. He'd spread his spare blanket for her, a rough wool that would offer some protection from the biting cold. When she finally curled up on it, she shivered violently, a deep, bone-rattling cold that the fire couldn't entirely banish. Her breathing grew shallow and strained. He felt her forehead and found it burning hot. A fever, the exertion, the exposure, the lack of food, it had all caught up to her. He knew he couldn't leave her like that. Moving carefully, he unwrapped a clean cloth from his saddlebag, dampened it with the last of his water, and gently dabbed at her fevered brow. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. She murmured something he couldn't understand, a soft, whimpering sound, but didn't resist his touch. It was then, as he carefully shifted her slightly to better reach her neck, that he saw it. The movement pulled the torn cloth of her dress higher on her back, revealing a patch of skin on her left shoulder blade. There, stark and sickening against her pale flesh, was a brand, not a fresh one, but old, healed over in a raised, puckered scar tissue. It was a symbol he didn't recognize, a crude, cruel mark, deliberately burned into her skin. A cold wave washed over Elias, colder than the desert night. His stomach clenched. He'd seen brands on cattle, on horses, even on outlaws as a form of punishment, but on a woman, etched into her very flesh like she was property. It was monstrous. His fingers hovered over the ugly mark, a primal rage stirring deep inside him. He wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it, but he forced himself to breathe, to remain calm. He pulled the blanket higher, covering the brand, burying the sight of it. He didn't ask. There was no need. The mark spoke a language all its own, a story of ownership, of cruelty, of a freedom brutally stolen. He continued to tend to her, changing the cool cloth, watching her breath, his jaw tight. He wouldn't ask about it. Not now, maybe not ever. What mattered was that she was here. And for now, she was safe, was. The next few days were a quiet vigil. Her fever broke, slowly, painfully, leaving her weaker than before. Elias hunted small game, stewed it over the fire, and nursed her back with spoonfuls of broth. He gave her the best portion of whatever he found, making sure she ate, even when she protested with a weak shake of her head. He spoke little, offering only what was necessary, respecting her silence. He knew too well that sometimes silence was the only shield a person had left. As she slowly regained her strength, the wild look in her eyes softened, replaced by a deep weariness. One morning, the sun warm on her face, she sat up without his help. She watched him as he tended to the horses, her gaze no longer fearful, but contemplative. "My name is Rosalie," she said, her voice still a little hoarse, but stronger than he'd heard it yet. It was the first time she had offered anything of herself. He stopped, turning to face her, a small, knowing nod. Elias Boone." She nodded back, then looked down at her hands, picking at a loose thread on her tattered dress. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the water, for the food, for not—" She trailed off, unable to voice the unspoken fear of being turned over. "Ain't no need for thanks," he said, returning to his task, though he kept an ear open for her. "Just glad to see you breathing easier." A long silence stretched between them, comfortable in its way, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "I ran from the house beyond the bluff." He stopped what he was doing, turning fully to her. He recognized the name, not the exact location, but the type of place she spoke of. Everyone knew of such houses. Isolated, sprawling estates in the deep canyon country where rich men carved out their own laws, far from any real justice. "It was a bad place," she continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. They kept me like a thing, like an animal." She didn't speak of the brand, but the unspoken horror of it hung in the air between them. "I just ran, in the night, barefoot. I just ran and kept running until I couldn't no more." Elias listened, his face impassive, but his mind had already begun to turn. Her story, though fragmented, resonated with a deep, personal ache within him. He'd seen such places, such men. He'd felt the sting of their cruelty firsthand. His own past, a bitter memory, began to unspool in his mind. He'd been barely 20. Green and hopeful, when he'd first signed on as a ranch hand for a man named Silas Thorne. Thorne was a cattle baron who owned a stretch of land so vast it took days to ride across. But Thorne wasn't just a rancher. He was a petty tyrant, a man who believed wealth gave him the right to own more than just land and cattle. Thorne had a way of collecting people, desperate men in debt, runaways, even native women from tribes pushed off their ancestral lands. He'd bind them with false contracts, impossible debts, promises that turned to chains. They worked his ranch, lived in squalor, and were beaten for the slightest transgression. Elias had seen it all, the casual brutality, the fear in the eyes of the other hands, the way the women were treated like possessions, passed around, their cries stifled by the vast, uncaring wilderness. One particularly sweltering afternoon, a young Comanche woman, barely more than a girl, had been caught trying to steal a handful of flour for her starving child. Thorne, in a fit of drunken rage, had ordered her whipped in front of the assembled hands, a brutal display meant to instill fear. Elias, young and full of a furious, unseasoned righteousness, had stepped forward, pleading with Thorne to stop, to show mercy. He remembered the glint in Thorne's eye, cold and predatory, the way the Baron had simply turned his gaze from the girl to Elias, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. Elias had been dragged away by Thorne's foreman, tied to the whipping post himself, and beaten until he barely clung to life. the taste of dust and his own blood, the searing pain, the helpless rage. It was all still sharp in his memory. He'd laid there, half-conscious, listening to the crack of the whip on his own flesh, knowing he'd been foolish, but knowing too that he couldn't have done otherwise. When he finally recovered enough to walk, weak and scarred, he'd ridden out of Thorn's land in the dead of night, never looking back. He'd carried the physical scars, a crisscross of old whip marks on his own back, but the deeper wounds were in his spirit, a profound distrust of men who wielded power without conscience, and a fierce, quiet resolve to never let himself be caught in such a trap again. That was years ago, but the memory was as fresh as the desert wind. Rosalie's whispered words, her haunted eyes, the cruel brand hidden beneath her dress. It all stirred those old wounds, those old angers, back to life. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a frightened woman, but a kindred spirit, marked by the same brutality, the same indifference of the world. "You can't stay out here, Rosalie," he said, his voice firm now, though still quiet. "Too exposed, too many eyes. Sooner or later, if someone's looking for you, they'll find you." He paused, letting her consider his words. "I got a cabin, up in the hills, remote. Nobody much knows about it. You could rest there, get your strength back, proper. Nobody'll bother you there." She looked up at him, her brow furrowed, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes, mixed with a desperate hope. "Why?" she asked, the single word heavy with all her past betrayals. He met her gaze squarely. "Because I ain't one for seeing folks get treated like property. And because," he added, a wry, almost bitter edge to his voice, "I ain't much fond of men who brand women either." He didn't elaborate on his own past, but his words carried a weight she understood. She studied him for another long moment, searching his eyes, perhaps for any hint of deceit. What she saw there, he hoped, was only a quiet understanding, a shared burden. Finally, slowly, she gave a hesitant nod. "All right," she whispered. "All right, Elias." The journey to his cabin was slow, a trek through a landscape that seemed to stretch on forever, cracked and parched under the relentless sun. Rosalie rode behind him on his pack-horse, a small, worn saddle she barely filled. She was still weak, and the harsh environment was draining. As they rode across a particularly desolate stretch of sun-baked earth, where the rocks shimmered with heat and the air was thick with the scent of dust and distant sage, Rosalie turned her head, her gaze fixed on the vast, indifferent sky. Her voice was faint, barely above a murmur, carried away by the wind. "I truly thought I'd die out here, just curl up and let the sun take me." There was no self-pity in her voice, just a stark, honest statement of fact. Elias glanced back at her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He knew that feeling, that deep, bone-weary resignation when the world felt too big, too cruel. But he also knew the stubborn spark that could refuse to be extinguished. He cleared his throat, his voice low and steady, a quiet promise in the vast silence of the desert. "Not if I can help it, Rosalie." And he meant it. He meant it with every fiber of his being, with every scar on his back, and every bitter memory that still haunted his nights. Not if he could help it. It took another 2 days of hard, slow travel to climb out of the basin and into the high hills. Elias pushed them only as hard as Rosalie could stand, stopping often. He watched her sway in the saddle, her face pale and set in lines of exhaustion. But she never once complained. She just held on, her gaze fixed on the sharp line of his shoulders, as if he were the only solid thing in a tilting world. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, tight structure of lodgepole pine he'd built himself, tucked into a high meadow surrounded by aspen and spruce. It was hard to find if you didn't know where to look, and that was exactly how Elias liked it. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. He kept a low fire banked even when he was away, to keep the damp out. He helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist, setting her on her feet. She stumbled, her legs weak, and he steadied her. But the moment her feet were firm, she pulled away from his touch, crossing her arms over her chest. He pretended not to notice, just nodded toward the door. "It ain't much," he said, pushing the heavy plank door open. "But it's warm, and the wind don't find its way in." Inside, it was clean and sparse, a single room, with a stone hearth dominating one wall, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner, and a larger built-in bed frame on the other side, piled with thick wool blankets and a buffalo hide. A few shelves held tins of coffee, flour, and beans. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and coffee. Rosalie just stood in the doorway, clutching her tattered dress, looking overwhelmed by the simple fact of 4 walls and a roof. "That cot's yours," Elias said, gesturing to the narrow bed. "I'll take the floor by the fire, long as you're here. Ought to be comfortable enough." He didn't want to spook her by offering the main bed. She shook her head. "No, I can sleep by the fire. I don't mind. I'm used to floors." "Didn't ask what you're used to," Elias said, his voice flat but not unkind. "I offered the cot. It's yours." He moved past her to stir the embers in the hearth, adding a fresh log. He didn't look at her, giving her time to accept the arrangement without argument. He set a pot of coffee to boil and fried up some salt pork and beans, the simple sounds of domestic life filling the small space. When he slid the tin plate onto the table in front of her, she stared at it for a full minute before picking up the fork. The first few nights were hard. The safety of the cabin seemed to unlock the terror she had kept at bay while she was running. She cried out in her sleep, sharp, terrified sounds that brought Elias bolt upright from his bedroll, his hand grabbing for his gun before he remembered where he was. He'd see her sitting up on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide and blind with fear. He learned not to approach her. The one time he did, just to lay a hand on her shoulder and tell her she was safe. She had flinched so violently she'd almost fallen to the floor, scrambling away from him like he was a striking snake. The look in her eyes, pure, animal panic, had stopped him cold. It was a look that said touch was not comfort, touch was pain. After that, when the nightmares came, he would just sit up and speak to the darkness. "You're safe, Rosalie," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "You're in the cabin. Ain't nobody here but me. You're safe." He would repeat it over and over, until her breathing evened out and she lay back down, pulling the blanket over her head. He moved slow around her, always letting her see his hands, never making a sudden move. He'd place her cup of coffee on the table rather than hand it to her. He'd announce when he was leaving to check his traps or hunt, and he'd make noise when he returned, whistling or stomping the mud off his boots, so she'd never be surprised by his presence. He gave her space, warmth, and quiet, the only medicines he had. As she healed, a stubborn restlessness took hold of her. She couldn't abide being idle. She started cleaning the cabin, scrubbing the floorboards with a fierce energy, organizing his meager supplies, mending the tears in his spare shirt with thread she'd found in his kit. He tried to tell her she needed to rest, but she just shook her head, her jaw set. "I got to earn my keep," she said, her voice thin but determined. "I don't take charity." "This ain't charity," Elias argued, frowning. "It feels like it," she replied, and that was the end of it. He woke one morning to the sharp, rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood. He bolted out the door and found her near the woodpile, swinging his heavy axe with a desperate, clumsy strength, trying to split a thick round of pine. She was panting, sweat rolling down her face despite the morning chill, and her arms were shaking with the strain. "What in God's name are you doing?" he demanded, striding over and taking the axe from her unresisting hands. "You'll bust your back, or take a foot off." "I told you," she panted, glaring at him, her chest heaving. I pull my weight. I ain't a doll. I ain't a pet. I work." The fury in her voice startled him. He looked at her, really looked at her, the fierce pride in her eyes, the desperate need to prove she was more than a helpless victim. He saw the fire in her, the same spark that must have driven her barefoot into the desert. A slow, quiet admiration settled over him. She wasn't broken, not entirely. She was just bent and fighting like hell to straighten back up. He handed the axe back to her, hilt first. "All right," he said quietly, "but you're holding it wrong. Your grip's too high. You'll get no power and snap the handle. Here." He stood beside her, not touching, and showed her how to brace her feet, how to let the weight of the axe head do the work. He watched her for a while, correcting her stance, and then he left her to it, letting her work out the rage and the fear on that woodpile. He let her clean, let her cook, let her chop, because he understood. He understood that work was a way to claim the body back, to prove that it was still hers to command. A few weeks passed. The sharp angles of her face softened as she ate regular meals. The color returned to her cheeks. The hunted look in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep, watchful quiet. But the brand remained. He never spoke of it, and she never showed it. She washed herself when he was gone, and she changed her clothes. He'd given her an old flannel shirt and a pair of canvas trousers he'd patched up, with her back always turned, always hidden. It was a secret they both knew, a shadow that lay between them even in the warmth of the cabin. Then, one afternoon, Elias returned from checking his snare line earlier than usual. He was walking up from the tree line when he heard splashing from the creek that ran through the meadow. He figured she was just gathering water, but as he got closer, he realized the splashing was too frantic, too violent. He heard a sound, a low, choked sob of pure frustration. He pushed through the willows and stopped dead. Rosalie was kneeling in the shallow, icy water, her back to him. Her shirt was tossed on the bank. She was scrubbing her left shoulder blade, scrubbing it with a handful of rough sand and creek stones, scrubbing it so hard her skin was raw and bleeding. She was crying, not loud sobs, but the desperate, angry tears of someone locked in a fight they could not win. "I won't let it stay," she hissed between clenched teeth, scrubbing harder, the water around her pink with her own blood. Get off me." A cold fist closed around Elias's heart. He moved forward, his boots silent on the soft earth. "Rosalie," she gasped, whirling around, trying to cover herself with her arms, her eyes wide with shame and panic at being seen. "Rosalie, stop," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He stepped into the creek, the cold water soaking his boots, and knelt in front of her. He reached out and took her hands, pulling them away from her bleeding shoulder. Her fingers were cut and raw from the sharp stones. He held her hands tightly, forcing her to look at him. "You'll hurt yourself something awful," he said softly. "It won't come off," she wept, her defenses crumbling. "I keep trying, I keep scrubbing, but it won't come off. It's still there. He marked me. Elias, like a cow." "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she hadn't heard from him before. He looked over her shoulder at the scar, now angry and inflamed from her scrubbing. "Stop fighting it. It's done. You can't scrub it out. It's part of the skin now." "But I feel it," she whispered, her whole body shaking. "Every minute, it burns. It reminds me that I'm not." "That mark don't own you anymore," he said, his voice dropping low, fierce. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark with a shared sorrow. "He put it there, but he ain't here. It's just a scar. Rosalie, just old skin. It don't mean nothing unless you let it. It don't say who you are." She stared at him, her breath catching. She searched his face, looking for the disgust, the revulsion she expected. She had lived so long believing that Mark defined her, made her unclean, ruined. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her back to him, a silent, terrifying offering of trust. "Look at it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I want you to see it. See what he did." Elias looked at the raw, puckered scar. The symbol was ugly, meaningless to him, but powerful in its cruelty. He felt that old rage rise in him, the same helpless anger he'd felt on Thorne's ranch. But he pushed it down. She didn't need his rage right now. She needed something else. He lifted his hand, his fingers calloused and rough from work, and with a touch so light it was barely there. He traced the outline of the brand. Rosalie flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but she didn't pull away. She expected his touch to burn, to feel like disgust, but it didn't. His fingers were hesitant, almost reverent, tracing the scar not as a mark of shame, but as a wound. She felt a tremor run through his hand as he touched it. When she finally turned back to look at him, her eyes scanning his face, she saw no disgust. She saw no pity. All she saw was a deep, profound sorrow in his eyes, a sorrow that mirrored her own. He wasn't looking at her like she was ruined goods. He was looking at her like he understood the pain of it. He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. "Come on," he said, his voice gruff to cover the emotion. "Let's get you out of this cold water. You'll catch your death. We need to clean that shoulder proper before it gets infected." He led her back to the cabin, and for the first time, she didn't pull her hand away from his. That night, after he had gently cleaned her shoulder with whiskey and bound it with a clean cloth, the dam of silence between them finally broke. They sat by the fire, the cabin warm against the mountain chill, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. "He bought me," Rosalie said suddenly, her voice flat, staring into the fire. "My uncle, after my ma died, he said he found me a good husband, a rich man out west. He called it a marriage contract." Elias just listened, his expression unreadable, puffing slowly on a hand-rolled cigarette. "It wasn't a marriage," she continued, her voice hardening. "It was a sale. The estate was deep in a canyon, miles from any town. Guards on the fences, walls. He had other women, girls, mostly. All of us bought, one way or another. All of us trapped. He liked to own things, pretty things, and he liked to mark what was his." She fell silent, but Elias didn't push. He knew the shape of the rest of the story. He'd seen it before. "He told me I was his property, by law and by God," she finished, her voice a dead whisper. "And he put that brand on me to prove it." Elias took a long drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing red in the dim light. He tossed the butt into the fire, watching it spark and die. "There's men in this world," he said, his voice a low growl, "who think a piece of paper or a bag of gold gives them the right to another person's soul. They build their kingdoms on the backs of folks they think are weaker." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his own gaze lost in the flames. "Worked for a man like that once, Silas Thorne, a cattle baron, owned half the territory, or thought he did. He kept folks on his ranch in debt, men and women both. Worked them like slaves, beat them when he felt the notion. He liked to make examples, liked to show everyone who held the whip." He paused, his hand unconsciously drifting to his own back, hidden beneath his shirt. "I tried to stop him once. Tried to stop him from whipping a young woman who'd done nothing but look at him wrong. He had his foreman tie me to the post instead. Whipped me till I was half dead. Taught me a lesson," he said. Rosalie looked at him, seeing the hard lines around his mouth, the darkness in his eyes. "What did you do?" "I healed up," Elias said, his voice flat. "And then I left. Rode out in the middle of the night. Never looked back, but I never forgot. A man don't forget the feel of a whip, and a woman don't forget the feel of a brand." He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "We both got marks, Rosalie, just different kinds." A new quiet settled between them, no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding. A few nights later, Rosalie was brushing her hair by the lamplight, or trying to. It was matted and tangled, broken short in places from her time in the wilderness. She was tugging at a particularly nasty knot, her frustration growing, when Elias stood up from the table. "Here," he said, taking the brush from her hand. "Sit." She hesitated, her body tensing. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said patiently. "Just trying to help. That hair's a mess. Needs cutting." She sat stiffly on the small stool, her back to him. He pulled a chair over and sat behind her, taking his sharp skinning knife from its sheath. She flinched as she saw the blade, but he just said, "Hold still. I used to shear sheep. Can't be much different." His hands were surprisingly gentle. He worked slowly, combing through the tangles, his knuckles brushing her neck. She forced herself to stay still, to breathe through the instinctive urge to flinch away from his touch, from the man at her back, from the sharp knife. He worked for almost an hour, cutting away the dead, matted ends, trimming the rest until it fell in a clean, straight line just above her shoulders. The rhythmic snip-snip of the knife was the only sound, comforting in its steadiness. When he was done, he set the knife down and ran the comb through it one last time. It felt lighter, cleaner. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. It was such a small thing, a haircut, but it felt like he had cut away more than just hair. He'd cut away the wildness, the filth of the running. Elias just grunted, putting his knife away. "You got nothing to thank me for yet," he said. But the fragile peace they'd built was not destined to last. The world was bigger than the small cabin, and the men in it had long memories. Down in the dusty streets of Prescott, a bounty poster had been nailed to the sheriff's wall. It was crude, but the description was clear. Runaway property, $200 reward. Female, young, pale hair branded on left shoulder. Men stopped to read it. Most shrugged and moved on. $200 was a lot of money, but the high country was a big place to lose a woman. But one man, a grizzled rancher named Pike, read it and his eyes narrowed. He'd seen a rider matching that description, a runaway bought by the reclusive baron down in the canyon country a year back. He knew the brand. He sent a runner west, to the men who specialized in retrieving lost property. Elias, oblivious to this, rode into town a week later for supplies. He needed salt, coffee, and more ammunition. He kept his visit short, spoke to no one he didn't have to, and started the long ride back up into the hills. He was halfway home, riding through a narrow pass, when his horse suddenly shied, ears pinning back. Elias reined in, his senses screaming. He scanned the ridgeline above him. Nothing, but he knew his horse. He dismounted, leading the mare, his rifle now in his hand. He found the signs 50 yards later, a fresh boot print, deep and heavy, where no boot print should be, a cigar butt, still damp, tossed in the bushes, and then the unmistakable sign of 3 horses, tied up in a thicket just off the main trail, their tracks deliberately hidden. Trackers. A cold dread settled in his stomach. They weren't looking for him. They were looking for her. He didn't ride back to the cabin. He circled wide, taking the long way, checking his back trail twice. He came in from the north, through the thick woods, hiding his horse and walking the last half-mile on foot. He found Rosalie feeding the horses, a rare, small smile on her face as his mare nudged her shoulder. The dread in his gut tightened. "Rosalie," he said, his voice low. She turned, the smile fading when she saw the look on his face. "Elias, what is it? What's wrong?" "Get inside," he said, grabbing his rifle. "We need to talk." Inside the cabin, with the door barred, he told her what he'd seen. 3 riders. Looked like trackers. They're sniffing around the pass. They might just be passing through, but I don't think so. Her face went ashen. All the color he'd seen return to her cheeks drained away, leaving her looking as pale and haunted as the day he'd found her. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "He sent them. Oh God, he sent them." Maybe, Elias said, checking the load in his rifle. Maybe not, but we'll need to be careful. Real careful. Keep the door barred. No fire tonight. The smoke'll give us away. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself, the old, self-protective gesture returning. That night, the cabin was cold and dark. They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, each sound magnified, each one a potential threat. Elias sat in the chair by the door, his rifle across his lap. Rosalie sat on her cot, wrapped in every blanket she had. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting pale light through the single window. "Elias?" Rosalie's voice was a small, trembling whisper in the dark. "I'm here. I don't want to go back." "I know." She left the cot, crossing the cold floor, and curled up on the floor beside his chair, drawing her blankets around her. It wasn't a request for comfort. Not really. It was the way a small animal seeks the shelter of a larger one when a predator is near. She sat close, her shoulder brushing his leg, close to him and close to the hearth, though it was cold. "I don't want to be sold again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'd rather die. I'd rather you shot me right here than let them take me back." Elias looked down at the top of her head, her pale hair shining faintly in the moonlight. He felt her trembling, a fine, constant shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached out, his hand hovering, and then, deliberately, he placed it on her shoulder. She flinched, but this time, she didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, just slightly. He was a quiet man, not given to promises he couldn't keep. He knew what it meant to fight men who believed they owned the world. He knew the cost, but feeling her terror, her small body shaking beside him, he felt that old, cold rage settle into a hard resolve. He tightened his grip on her shoulder, his voice a low, rough vow in the darkness. "Ain't nobody taking you from me." The morning after the riders had passed, the air in the cabin was thick with a new, cold tension. The fragile peace was gone. Elias knew, and Rosalie knew, that hiding was no longer enough. Safety was not something he could just give her. It was something she would have to be ready to take. "You're going to learn to shoot," he said flatly over breakfast. It was not a request. He took her out into the meadow, clear of the cabin, and pushed his own Winchester rifle into her hands. The sudden weight of it surprised her, the heavy oiled steel and smooth wood. It was a tool, like an axe or a shovel, but it was cold, and it held a terrible, final power. "I've never held a gun," she whispered, her hands trembling as she tried to balance it. "I know," he said. "That's why we're out here. A gun is a heavy thing to carry, but it's a heavier thing to need and not have." He stood beside her, close but not touching, his voice low and patient. He showed her how to load it, how to chamber a round, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. "Brace it tight," he warned. "If you hold it loose, it'll kick you clean off your feet. Don't be afraid of it. You're in charge of it. It ain't in charge of you." She flinched when he said, "shoulder," her mind immediately going to the brand. She tried to settle the hard wooden stock against her right side, but it felt wrong. "No," she said, her voice tight. "My left." Elias frowned. "You shoot left-handed?" "I don't know," she said, her jaw setting in that stubborn line he recognized. "But I'll shoot with this shoulder." She settled the stock against her branded left shoulder. It was a strange, silent defiance. If she was to learn to fight, she would do it with the very part of her they had tried to claim. "All right," Elias said, understanding. "Hold it tight, then. Line up that sight on the end of the barrel with the notch back here. Put it on that dead stump. Now breathe out slow and squeeze. Do not pull. Squeeze." She held her breath, her arms shaking from the weight. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that echoed off the mountains. The rifle bucked hard, slamming the stock into her scar, and the shock of it, combined with the noise, made her cry out and stumble backward, dropping the gun. She hadn't even seen where the bullet went. "I told you to squeeze," Elias said, his voice calm, picking up the rifle and checking it. "And I told you to keep your eyes open. You cannot hit what you do not see." "It hurt," she whispered, rubbing her shoulder, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "It'll hurt worse if one of those men gets his hands on you," he said, his voice hard, but not cruel. "This kind of hurt, you can master. The other kind, you cannot. Now. Again." He made her do it again, and again. All morning, the meadow cracked with the sound of gunfire. She learned to handle the kick, to keep her eyes open, to breathe. Her shoulder was a throbbing, purple bruise, but a new, cold fury began to burn in her. The fear was still there, a sickness in her stomach, but the fury was hotter. She thought of the men who were hunting her. She thought of the man who had branded her, and she squeezed the trigger. She was a fast learner. The fear and the fury were a powerful fuel. By the end of the day, she was hitting the stump more often than not. The training didn't stop with the rifle. He taught her how to ride. Not just how to sit a horse, but how to ride. "You do not ride on him," he explained, gesturing to his mare. "You ride with him. You feel what he's feeling. You tell him what you need, and you listen to what he needs. If you're running, you got to know how to pick your path, how to save his wind, how to ask him for everything he's got and not kill him doing it." He took her on hard rides through the hills, teaching her to gallop, to cut through ravines, to read the terrain, and he taught her how to disappear. "Everything leaves a mark," he said, kneeling by a stream. "You cross a stream, you cross on rock, not mud. You break a branch, you break it clean under, not snap it off where the white wood shows. You build a fire, you use dry wood that don't smoke, and you bury the ashes deep, and put the sod back on top. You learn to walk like you ain't there. You learn to be smoke." She soaked it all in, her mind sharp, her body hardening with the work. The soft, terrified woman he'd found in the dry wash was being burned away, replaced by someone leaner, quieter, and far more dangerous. A new rhythm settled over the cabin, a rhythm of survival. But with it, something else grew. The silence between them, once rooted in fear and caution, began to warm. They were a team now, bound by a shared secret and a shared danger. They moved around the small cabin with an easy grace, no longer two strangers, but two people who understood each other's boundaries. He'd pass her the coffee pot, and his fingers would brush hers. And she wouldn't flinch. She'd mend a tear in his canvas jacket, and he'd stand still, watching her fingers work, a quiet appreciation in his eyes. The intimacy was built in these small, unspoken moments. It was in the way he'd gut a rabbit and she'd have the skillet hot before he was done. It was in the way she'd clean his rifle, her hands now steady and sure, and he'd watch her, a slow, small smile touching his lips. They were two solitary people who had, without meaning to, become a pair. One night, a storm blew in from the north, a wild, raging thing that lashed the cabin with sheets of rain and screamed through the pines. The world outside was a dark, howling chaos. Inside, the cabin was a small, warm pocket of safety. Elias had barred the door, and the fire roared in the hearth, casting a flickering, golden light over the room. They sat near the fire, the tension of the day's training draining away, replaced by the sleepy comfort of the heat. Rosalie had been quiet all evening, staring into the flames, her face thoughtful. Elias was cleaning his revolver, the rhythmic click-click of the cylinder turning the only sound besides the storm. Finally, Rosalie turned to him. She looked at his face, at the hard lines etched around his eyes and mouth, at the quiet strength in his hands. He was not a soft man. He was, she realized, the hardest man she had ever known. But his hardness was a different kind. It was the hardness of the mountains, a thing you could rely on, a thing that endured. slowly, as if testing the air. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, flat against the rough flannel of his shirt. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her palm. He stopped his work, his hands going still, his gaze dropping to her hand, then rising to meet her eyes. He didn't move, just waited. "You don't look at me like I'm ruined," she said, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the wind. Elias held her gaze, his own eyes dark and unreadable in the firelight. He thought of the brand on her shoulder, the raw fear he'd seen in her, the strength she'd shown every day since. "Because you're not," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "You're scarred, and there's a hell of a difference." He saw the sheen of tears in her eyes, but she didn't look away. The air between them grew thick, charged with all the things they had never said. He saw her swallow, saw the small, trembling vulnerability in her expression, and in that moment, he saw her, not as a victim, not as a runaway, but as Rosalie. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hesitant, chapped, and tasted of coffee and wood smoke. It was a kiss of shared solitude and desperate survival. But as he deepened it, a sudden, violent tremor ran through her. She gasped, her body going rigid, and she pulled back, scrambling away from him, her eyes wide with a familiar, panicked terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice choked, curling into herself by the fire. I can't, Elias felt a sharp pang, not of rejection, but of a deep, sorrowful anger at the men who had done this to her, who had broken her in this way. He didn't reach for her. He just kept his hands open, resting on his knees. "There's nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice quiet. He reached out, not for her body, but for her hand, taking it in his. His grip was warm and firm, a simple, grounding touch. She let him hold it, her fingers trembling in his. "We go slow," he said, his thumb rubbing the back of her hand. "We go only when you want. I ain't him, Rosalie. I ain't ever going to be him. I can wait." She looked at him, her breathing still ragged, and gave a small, jerky nod. She didn't pull her hand away, and they sat like that for a long time, holding hands in front of the fire, while the storm raged outside. The storm passed, but the threat it had held at bay returned with the clear morning sun. Elias was chopping wood, the clean thwack of his axe the only sound in the meadow, when his mare, tethered nearby, suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked, and let out a low nicker. Elias froze. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the woodpile and slipped into the trees, his movements silent. "Rosalie," he called, his voice low but carrying. "Inside. Bar the door." He heard the cabin door slam and the heavy wooden bar fall into place. He moved through the trees, circling wide, until he got a vantage point on the trail below. He saw them, 3 riders, the same 3. He was sure of it. They weren't riding fast. They were sniffing, as he'd called it. One of them, a heavy-set man with a long duster, was leaning down from his saddle, studying the ground. They had found the trail. They were coming up the path, slow and cautious, their eyes scanning the trees. They were good, but Elias was better. He was on his own land. He waited until they were in the narrow part of the path, where the rocks rose high on both sides. He lifted his rifle, took aim at a boulder 20 feet in front of the lead rider, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a deafening roar. The bullet hit the rock and exploded, sending shards of granite spraying through the air. The lead rider's horse screamed and reared, and the man cursed, fighting to control it. All 3 men dove from their saddles, pulling their own rifles and scrambling for cover. "That's far enough," Elias' voice boomed from the trees, echoing off the rocks. He'd moved as soon as he fired, and he was already in a new spot. "This is private land. The next one won't be a warning." The men stayed hidden, scanning the high rocks, but they couldn't see him. He was just a voice and a bullet. "We ain't looking for trouble, mister," one of them yelled back, his voice strained. "We're tracking runaways. Got a poster." "I don't care what you got," Elias yelled. "You're tracking on my land, and I'm telling you to turn around. The only thing you'll find up here is a bullet." There was a long silence. The men muttered to each other. They were trackers, bounty men, not soldiers. They weren't being paid to get into a pitched battle with a man who had the high ground and a good rifle. All right, the lead man finally shouted. "We're pulling back. No need to get twitchy." Elias watched, his rifle steady, as they climbed back onto their horses, their movements jerky and angry. They cast nervous glances up at the trees, then turned their horses and rode back down the trail, disappearing from view. Elias didn't move for a long time. He waited, listening, until he was sure they were gone. He knew it wasn't over. They'd be back. They knew she was here now, or at least that someone was here worth protecting. They would circle, and they would wait, and they would try again. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. Rosalie unbarred the door, her own face pale, her hands clutching the rifle he had given her. "They're gone," he said, stepping inside. "For now." "They'll come back," she whispered. "Aye," he said, staring out the window. "They'll be back." The rest of the day passed in a heavy, strained silence. The close call had shattered their fragile sense of safety. Rosalie saw the grim set of Elias's jaw, the way he constantly scanned the tree line. She looked at his strong hands, his steady gaze, and a cold, terrible certainty settled in her heart. He had fired a shot for her. He had put himself between her and them. She was the reason those men were here. She was the reason he was in danger. She was a sickness she had brought to his door, and he was going to die for it. He had saved her from the desert, given her warmth, given her safety, treated her like a person, and in return, she was going to be the reason he was shot and left to die on the mountain. She couldn't let that happen. She loved him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She loved him for his quiet, his strength, his gentleness, and she couldn't be the reason he died. That night, she lay on her cot, pretending to sleep. She listened as Elias's breathing deepened into the slow, heavy rhythm of exhaustion. He was sleeping in his chair by the door, his rifle in his lap. When she was sure he was asleep, she slipped out of the cot. She moved with the silence he had taught her. She packed a small bundle of food, some dried venison, a hunk of bread. She grabbed her blanket. She looked at his rifle, the one she'd been practicing with, but left it. It was his. She found a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth and a scrap of paper he used for rolling cigarettes. Her hand was shaking, but she forced it steady. By the faint moonlight, she wrote, "I can't be the reason you die. I'm sorry. Don't come for me." She left the note on the table where he would see it. She looked at him one last time. His face relaxed in sleep, and her heart felt like it was being torn from her chest. She quietly lifted the bar on the door, slipped out into the cold night, and ran. Elias woke to the cold. The fire was dead, and a bitter draft was coming from the door. It was barely ajar. He was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding, rifle in his hand, thinking the riders had come, but the cabin was empty. "Rosalie?" Silence. Then he saw it, the note on the table. He snatched it up, his blood running cold as he read the simple, stark words. "Damn her!" he whispered, a hot, bright fury rising in his chest. Damn her stubborn pride. He didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket, his ammunition, and was out the door in less than a minute. The sky was just beginning to turn a pale, sick gray in the east. A cold rain was starting to fall, a miserable, soaking drizzle. He found her tracks easily, leading to the stable. His mare was gone. She had a head start, but she didn't know the mountains like he did, and she was on his best horse. He took his pack mule, a stubborn, steady creature, and cut across the ridge, knowing a shortcut she couldn't possibly know. He found her halfway down the mountain, riding hard through the driving rain, her head down, the blanket pulled over her shoulders. "Rosalie!" His voice was a roar that cut through the sound of the storm. She screamed, pulling the mare to a halt, whirling around. She saw him on the trail above her, his face a mask of thunder, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. "Get off the horse," he commanded. "No!" she cried, her voice thin and desperate. "Go back, Elias. They'll kill you. I'm doing this for you." "The hell you are!" he yelled, urging the mule down the slick path, blocking her way. "You're doing this because you're a coward. You're running again. You think this is saving me? You think I want to live, knowing you're out here, alone, waiting for them to find you, waiting for them to drag you back." He grabbed the mare's bridle, his face inches from hers. "You don't get to decide what you're worth to me," he roared, the words torn from his throat, raw with a pain and fury she had never seen. "You don't get to decide what my life is for. I made my choice. I made it the day I gave you that water. You do not get to take that choice away from me." Tears were streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "But you'll die," she sobbed. I cannot be the reason." "Maybe I will," he said, his voice dropping, but no less intense. "But I'll die on my feet, fighting for something I give a damn about. That is a hell of a lot more than most men get. Now you get off that horse, or so help me, I will pull you off." She stared at him, her whole body shaking. His fury, his words, they broke through the last of her resolve. This was not a man saving a victim. This was a man claiming his right to fight for his own. She didn't move, so he did. He reached up, grabbed her by the waist, and pulled her from the saddle. Her legs gave out as soon as her feet hit the mud. She collapsed against him, her face buried in his soaking jacket, and she sobbed. She wept for everything she had lost, for the brand on her back, for the kindness of this man, and for the terrible, beautiful fact that he would not let her go. He held her, his arms wrapped tight around her, his own body trembling with anger and relief. He just held her there, in the mud and the rain, letting her cry it out, his face buried in her wet hair. They rode back to the cabin in silence, Rosalie on the mare, him on the mule. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering, and emotionally shattered. The cabin felt cold and empty when they returned. Elias barred the door, his movement stiff. He started a fire, his back to her. Rosalie stood dripping in the middle of the room, shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Get those wet clothes off," he said, his voice gruff, not looking at her. "Both of us. We'll catch our death." He turned away, stripping off his own wet jacket and shirt, tossing them near the hearth. He stood in his trousers, his back to her, warming his hands. She saw the scars on his back, the old white whip marks, stark against his skin. We both got marks. Her fingers were numb, fumbling with the buttons of the shirt he'd given her. She peeled the wet clothes from her body, her teeth chattering. She stood there, in the small, worn shift she wore beneath, vulnerable and cold. Elias turned, a thick wool blanket in his hands. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her thin, strong body, at the brand on her shoulder, at the goose flesh on her skin. The anger was gone. The fury was gone. All that was left was the raw, shaken truth that lay between them. He stepped forward and wrapped the blanket around her, pulling her close. "You're freezing," he murmured, his hands rubbing her arms through the wool. She leaned into him, her cold face pressing against his warm, bare chest. She felt the heat of his skin, the thud of his heart. He had come for her. He had yelled at her, and he had come for her. She looked up at him. "Elias," she whispered. He looked down at her, and his promise from the other night echoed in the small room. "We go slow. We go only when you want." And in that moment, she wanted. This was not about fear. This was not about being taken. This was about choosing. This was about answering his vow with one of her own. She rose on her toes and kissed him. This time, she did not pull back. This time, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight, and the kiss deepened, all the rain and fear and anger and desperation melting into a heat that started deep in his belly. He picked her up, his arms strong, and carried her the few feet to the thick buffalo hide in front of the fire. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers, asking the question without words. She answered by pulling the blanket open, her gaze steady, offering not just her body, but her scarred and fighting soul. He lay down beside her, his hand tracing the curve of her face, his thumb wiping a smudge of mud from her cheek. And there, in the small, safe circle of the firelight, with the storm beginning to die outside, they chose each other. It was not a gentle coming together. It was desperate and clumsy and honest. It was a claiming. It was two scarred, broken people finding a whole, perfect moment, defying the world that had tried to tear them apart. It was a promise, sealed in flesh and fire, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning light that filtered into the cabin felt different. The air was still, and the world outside was washed clean from the storm, but the quiet was heavier. What had passed between them in front of the fire had changed the shape of the room. It hadn't been a soft thing, but a raw and necessary one. It was a promise made in the dark, and it hadn't changed what was waiting for them outside the door. If anything, it had only made the stakes higher, clearer. They moved around each other with a new, quiet knowledge. When he handed her the coffee pot, his fingers brushed hers, and a jolt went through them both, a silent acknowledgement. But there was no time for softness. The trackers were still out there. The shot Elias had fired was a declaration of war. Down in the muddy streets of the nearest town, the three trackers Elias had warned off were nursing their pride and their whiskey in a smoky saloon. They were sore, and they were spooked. "He was dug in deep," the lead man grumbled into his glass. "Had the high ground, fired wide on purpose, just to make us dance. Ain't paid enough to get planted on some hillside for a runaway." "But she's there," his partner said, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. "He wouldn't have fired if she wasn't." A third man, sitting alone at a corner table, listening, finally spoke. His voice was dry, like stones rubbing together. "You're paid to track, boys, not to think, and you did a poor job of it." The three men turned, their expressions souring. They knew this man, Merritt. He was a bounty hunter, but he wasn't like them. He didn't just track, he hunted. He had a reputation for cruelty. But more than that, he had a reputation for patience. He was sharp-eyed, thin as a rail, and wore a clean black coat, which seemed unnatural in this dusty, rough country. He enjoyed his work, and it showed in his cold, almost amused eyes. "He had a rifle, Merritt," the lead man said, "defensive, and he knew how to use it." Merritt took a slow sip of his drink. "A man with a rifle protecting something, that tells you where the honeypot is, but you just stirred the bees." He stood up, dropping a few coins on the table. $200, and you let a single rifle scare you off." He shook his head, a small, reptilian smile touching his lips. "The Baron will be disappointed. I, on the other hand, am intrigued. I'll take the job, and I'll bring the girl back. Or, at least, the brand." He walked out, the batwing doors swinging shut behind him, leaving a chill in the room. Back in the cabin, Elias was already packing. He was rolling dried venison into canvas, checking his ammunition, his movements economical and grim. Rosalie watched him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "They'll be back," he said, not looking at her. "Not just three this time. They'll come heavy. That warning shot just told them they were in the right place." "So we leave?" she asked, her voice quiet. "We leave," he confirmed. He pulled down an old, worn map from a shelf and spread it on the table. He tapped a spot far to the north. Idaho Territory. It's a long ride, a hard one. But it's new country. Rough. A man from down here ain't got no law, no pull. Up there, we can get lost. Find a piece of land. Start over. Rosalie felt a surge of pure, desperate relief. To run, to get lost, to be so far away that no one would ever think to look for her. That was all she had ever wanted. "Yes," she said, her voice thick. "Idaho, let's go now." She started to gather her few things. The blanket, the comb, but Elias didn't move. He was still standing over the map, his gaze distant, his expression hardened. He was staring at the fire, but he was seeing something else. He was seeing her branded shoulder. He was seeing the whip scars on his own back. "Running," he said, his voice low. "Ain't gonna fix it, Rosalie. It ain't gonna burn that mark off your skin." She stopped, turning to him, a new dread creeping in. "What do you mean? You said we'd be safe." "We might be," he said, turning to face her. "For a while. But he'll still be there. That man in that house, he'll still be there. And he'll just buy another girl, and another, and he'll still think he owns you. That brand won't ever fade. Not in his mind, and not in yours. Every time you look at it, you'll be remembering that he's still out there, living fat while you're hiding." "What are you saying?" she whispered, though she already knew. "I'm saying we don't run north," he said, his voice flat and hard. "We run south, straight back to that estate." A cold, visceral panic seized her. Her breath hitched. "No." It was a gasp. "No, Elias, you don't know what it's like. It's a fortress. It's got walls, guards. They'll kill us before we get within a mile. I will not go back there. I will not." She was backing away from him, her hands raised, as if to ward off the very idea. "I ain't asking you to go back as a prisoner," he said, his voice rising, intense. He stepped forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. She flinched, but he held her, his grip firm. "I'm asking you to go back as a reckoning. I ran from Thorne. I ran for years, and every day I woke up knowing he was still out there, still beating men, still using those women. Every day. It ate a little piece of my soul. Running don't end it. It just lets it fester." "I don't care about your soul. I care about you living," she cried, tears of terror and rage in her eyes. "He'll kill you. And for what? For some idea of justice? I'd rather be hiding and have you alive than stand over your grave. And I'd rather be in that grave than hiding with you, knowing we let him win," Elias countered, his voice raw. He shook her, just slightly. "This ain't just about him. This is about you. I want you to be free, not just safe. Free, and you won't ever be free as long as that place is standing, as long as he's breathing the air." He softened his grip, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. His eyes were burning into hers. "I want the world to see what they did to you. But more than that, I want you to watch it fall. I want you to be there when we pull it down, stone by stone. I want you to see the look on his face when he realizes the property he branded has come back to burn him to the ground." She stared at him, her breathing ragged. The terror was still there, a cold sickness in her stomach, but beneath it, his words had lit that other, hotter spark, the fury, the rage she had poured into splitting wood, the focus she had found in the rifle sights. He wasn't asking her to be a victim. He was asking her to be the fire. He was offering her not just an escape, but a cleansing. Her trembling slowly subsided. She looked at this man, who was willing to ride into hell for her, not to save her, but to fight beside her. She put her hand over his on her shoulder. "All right," she whispered, her voice shaking but gaining a terrible, cold strength. "All right, Elias, we watch it fall." A grim smile touched his lips. "Good, but we ain't going alone. We'll need help, fresh horses, supplies, and information. I know a man." They left the cabin an hour later, taking only what they could carry, leaving the door unbarred, as if they'd just stepped out. They rode hard and fast, not north, but southeast, down out of the high hills and into the wide, rolling grasslands of the next valley. They skirted the town, keeping to the low places, traveling for most of the day until they came to a ranch nestled in a bend of the Verde River. It was not a huge ranch, but it was prosperous. The fences were mended, the stock was healthy, and the small adobe house was solid and neat. A man was on the porch, watching them approach. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and held a rifle balanced easy in the crook of his arm. He was a black man, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes watchful and intelligent. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice a deep, clear baritone. "It's me, Isaac," Elias called, raising a hand. The man, Isaac, squinted, and then a slow smile spread across his face. He lowered the rifle. "Elias Boone, thought a snake had gotten you years ago." They dismounted, and the two men clasped hands, a strong, solid grip of deep, old friendship. "Isaac, this is Rosalie," Elias said. Isaac turned his gaze to her. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." He looked at her, and his smile faded. He saw the thinness of her face, the way she stood just a little behind Elias, the haunted, fierce look in her eyes. Isaac, a freed man who had made his own way in a hard world, recognized that look. He had harbored others like her, runaways and cast-offs, on their way to someplace safer. "Come inside," he said, his voice gentle. "The wife's got coffee on." Inside, they sat at a clean wooden table. Elias laid it out. Plain and simple. The estate, the brand, the plan. Isaac listened, his expression growing grim. When Elias was finished, Isaac sat back, steepling his fingers. "Elias, you ain't just talking about stirring the bees. You're talking about kicking the hive over and setting fire to it. That man, the Baron she speaks of. He's got more than guards. He's got money. He's got the law in his pocket. You ride in there, you ain't riding out." "He's got ledgers," Elias said quietly. "Rosalie told me. Proof. Of the contracts. Of the girls. And you aim to get them?" Rosalie, who had been silent, spoke up. Her voice was clear and cold. "We aim to get the ledgers, and then we aim to burn the house to the ground." Isaac looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. He saw the brand on her shoulder, visible where the collar of her shirt gaped. He looked from her to Elias, and he understood. This was not a rescue. This was a war. He sighed, rubbing his face. "You always were a stubborn fool. Elias, you get a notion of justice in your head, and you're like a bull with one eye. You'll charge, even if it's off a cliff." "Will you help us, Isaac?" Elias asked. Isaac was quiet for a long moment. "This ain't my fight." "I know," Elias said. "But," Isaac continued, "I surely do hate to see a man like that win." He stood up. "You'll need fresh horses. Yours are spent. You'll need food, more ammunition, and a map of the canyon lands that ain't 30 years old, and you'll need a place to hide when you're done. If you get done, you can have it all. But, Elias, you die on this fool quest. I ain't coming to collect the body." "That's all I ask," Elias said. They left Isaac's ranch just before dusk. Resupplied, their new horses fresh and strong. They rode toward the town of Prescott, needing to cross the main road south. They moved carefully, avoiding the trail, keeping to the ravines. They were in a dry wash, the light fading fast, when the shot came. It wasn't a warning. The bullet slammed into the dirt just inches from Elias's horse, kicking up a spray of gravel. "Merit!" Elias yelled, recognizing the tactic, not the man. He launched himself from the saddle, tackling Rosalie and pulling her down from her own horse. They tumbled behind a shallow embankment as a second shot whined over their heads, sending their horses screaming and scattering. "Elias Boone!" The voice echoed from the ridge above them, cold and amused. "You're harboring stolen property. I got a warrant for the girl. Throw her out, and I'll let you walk away." "Go to hell," Elias yelled back, pulling his rifle. He peered over the edge. He could just see him, a dark shape against the twilight sky. He was alone, but he had the high ground. "I'm gonna draw his fire," Elias whispered to Rosalie, his voice tight. "He's got the angle. When I shoot, you run for those rocks to the left. Get cover." "No," she hissed, gripping her own rifle. "I'm not leaving you." "That ain't a request, damn it," he growled. "He wants you, not me. He'll be watching you. Now move when I say." Elias rose up, firing a quick shot toward the ridge. Merritt fired back instantly. The bullet whined past Elias's ear. He ducked, then rose again to fire. A second shot from the ridge, almost simultaneous. Elias cried out, a sharp, choked grunt, and fell back, clutching his shoulder. "Elias!" Rosalie screamed, scrambling to him. "I'm hit," he gritted out, his face pale, blood already seeping through his fingers. "Damn it, the shoulder!" "Got him!" Merritt's triumphant laugh echoed down. "Now it's your turn, girlie. Nowhere to run." Rosalie looked at Elias, at the blood welling up, at the pain in his eyes. She looked up at the ridge, where Merritt was now moving, trying to get a clearer shot. All the fear, all the panic, it just evaporated, burned away by a pure, cold, white-hot rage. The training kicked in. "Stay down," she ordered Elias, her voice a low command. "Rosalie, don't be a fool! Run!" he gasped. But she wasn't listening. She didn't run for the rocks. She bellied down, resting her rifle on the hard-packed dirt of the embankment. She remembered Elias's voice. "Brace it tight, breathe out, squeeze." Merritt was moving again, a dark shadow against the last light. He was exposed for just a second, confident, focused on the spot where Elias had fallen. She didn't aim for the man. He was too small, the light too bad. She aimed for the big, solid shape beside him. She aimed for his horse. She took a breath, let it out, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of her rifle was sharp and clean. It was followed by a terrible, high-pitched scream that was not human. Merritt yelled, a sound of pure surprise and fury, as his horse collapsed beneath him. Pinning him for a moment before he scrambled free, he was on foot. "Now!" Elias roared, staggering to his feet, his good arm bringing his own rifle up. "Run!" He fired twice toward the ridge, the bullets kicking up dirt near Merritt, forcing him to stay down behind his dead horse. Rosalie was already running, pulling the reins of her panicked horse, which hadn't run far. She scrambled into the saddle as Elias grabbed his own mount. He hauled himself up, his wounded arm hanging useless, and they galloped away into the darkness, leaving Merritt stranded miles from town, cursing their names into the dust. They rode for hours. Elias slumped in the saddle, Rosalie guiding her horse close beside him, her hand on his back, holding him upright. He was half-conscious, weak from blood loss, when they finally stumbled upon an old, collapsed barn, the relic of a homestead long since burned or abandoned. "We have to stop," Rosalie said, her voice shaking. She helped him down, her arms straining under his dead weight. He collapsed onto a pile of dry, dusty hay, his breathing shallow. "The bullet," he gasped, his teeth chattering. "Check it." With trembling hands, she unbuttoned his bloody shirt. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole in his left shoulder, but she nearly wept with relief when she saw the exit wound on his back. "It went through," she whispered. "It went clean through." "Good," he breathed. "Whiskey in the saddlebag, and the needle." She ran out, grabbing his bag. She brought it back, her hands covered in his blood. She uncorked the whiskey. "Elias, this is going to hurt." "Just do it," he gritted, his eyes closing. She poured the raw spirits into the wound. He arched off the hay, a strangled scream tearing from his throat, his body going rigid, but he didn't pass out. He fell back, panting, sweat pouring down his face. Rosalie threaded the small needle from his kit, the same one she had mended his shirt with. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely see. "I don't know how," she wept. "Yes, you do," he whispered, his good hand finding hers. "Just pull the skin together, like cloth. Do it." She took a deep, shuddering breath, and she did it. She pushed the needle through his flesh, her own stomach churning. He grunted with every stitch, his knuckles white, but he never made another sound. She stitched the front, then the back, her work clumsy but tight. When she was done, she tore strips from her own underskirt and bound the wound tightly. He lay back, his skin the color of ash, but his eyes were open, and they were watching her. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers brushing the tears and dirt from her cheek. "You shot his horse?" he murmured, his voice faint. "I aimed for the horse," she whispered, her body finally succumbing to the tremors of shock. A weak, pained chuckle escaped him. Smart girl. His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw a raw, aching pride. You're braver than any man I've ever known. Rosalie, ever known." She finished the knot on the bandage and collapsed beside him, laying her head on his good shoulder, just breathing him in, the smell of blood and sweat and dust. He was alive. After a long time, she sat up. The moonlight was filtering through the broken roof of the barn, painting them in pale, ghostly stripes. He was breathing easier, his eyes closed, but not asleep. She looked at him, at this impossible, stubborn man who had taken a bullet for her. Her gaze drifted from his freshly bandaged shoulder to his chest, and then to his back, where his torn shirt revealed the old, white scars from Thorn's whip. Slowly, tenderly, she reached out her finger and traced the path of one of the raised lines. He shivered at her light touch, a different kind of shiver, but he didn't pull away. "Maybe we both got marks," she said, her voice soft but hard as new steel. "His brand, Thorn's whip." She leaned down, her face close to his, her eyes fierce and clear in the moonlight. But they don't get the last word. They had to hide for 4 days in that collapsed barn. Elias's fever came on fast, a hot, angry thing that left him shaking and muttering in the hay. The bullet had gone through clean, but the wound was still a raw, open invitation to infection. Rosalie had to be more than a nurse. She had to be a hunter, a guard, and a rock. The skills he had taught her were what kept them alive. She took his good rifle, her own still lost in the dark, and slipped out of the barn like a ghost. She moved with the silence he had demanded of her, her senses screaming, watching every shadow, every broken twig. She was terrified, but the terror was a cold, sharp tool now, not a blinding panic. She shot 2 rabbits, and she didn't flinch. She cleaned them with his skinning knife, her hands steady, and cooked the meat over a tiny, smokeless fire of dried twigs, hidden deep in a thicket. She brought him water from a seep she found, using his hat as a bucket. She forced him to drink, cradling his head in her lap, his skin burning hot against her. She bathed his wound with the last of the whiskey, ignoring his pained groans. She sat vigil while he slept, the heavy Winchester across her knees, her back to the rotted wall, watching the darkness, listening. Merritt was out there. She knew it, stranded, furious, and on foot. He'd be coming, but she would be ready. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Elias woke, his eyes clear but hollow, his body weak as a newborn colt's. He saw her sitting there, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, but the rifle steady across her lap. "You're a hell of a sight, Rosalie," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You're not so pretty yourself," she replied, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. "Can you ride?" "I can," he said, gritting his teeth as he sat up. "Not fast, but I can ride. They left that night under a sliver of moon. They rode south, not north. Every mile was a new kind of agony for Elias. His shoulder throbbed with every step of the horse. But he never spoke of it. He just rode, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Rosalie rode beside him, no longer behind him, her eyes constantly scanning their back trail. They were a matched pair, scarred and hunted, but moving as one. It took them another week, traveling slow, hiding by day, moving by night, until they came to the high canyon country. And one evening, as the sun was bleeding red into the western dust, Elias reined in his horse on a high ridge. He nodded downward. "There!" Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. She felt the blood drain from her face. It was not a ranch, it was a fortress, the estate of Baron Vance. It sat in a wide basin, a sprawling, two-story house built of stone and dark wood. A baronial monstrosity that looked like it had been carved from the arrogance of the land itself. It was surrounded by a high, thick wooden fence, too tall for a horse to jump. And she knew there was only one main gate. She could see guards, dark specks with glinting rifles, patrolling the perimeter. It was just as she remembered, a prison built to look like a palace. "Oh God, Elias," she whispered, her hands tightening on the reins, the old panic coiling in her belly. "It's just wood and stone," he said, his voice quiet, though his own face was grim. His shoulder ached, a sharp reminder of merit. "It can burn." They made a cold camp that night, hidden in the rocks, watching the house. Rosalie, her voice flat and dead, told him everything she remembered. The layout, the number of guards, the name of the foreman, a brutal man named Clegg, the routine of the Baron himself, how he would take his brandy in his study after supper, the same study where he kept his books, his contracts, his ledgers. "The plan," Elias said, his voice low, "is the one Isaac and I talked about. It's ugly, but it's the only way in." "The replacement," Rosalie whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Aye." He looked at her, his eyes hard in the starlight. "Can you do it? Can you play the part?" She thought of the raw, bleeding skin on her shoulder from where she'd tried to scrub the brand away. She thought of Elias, gritting his teeth against her needle. She thought of the cold, dead eyes of Baron Vance. "I can," she said, her voice like flint. The next day, they prepared. They used the last of the water to wash the trail dust from their faces. Elias took his knife and carefully shaved, wincing as the blade scraped his skin. He put on the clean shirt Isaac had given him, a dark, respectable broadcloth. He looked less like a drifting cowboy and more like a man of means, a cattleman, perhaps, with a hard eye for business. Rosalie braided her hair, tight and severe. She pulled her ragged collar close, hiding her neck. Elias looked at her. "You need to look broken," he said, his voice rough. "He'll expect it. He'll admire it." Rosalie's lip curled, but she understood. She rubbed dirt on her own cheeks, under her eyes, to make her look tired, worn down. She practiced walking with her head bowed, her hands clasped, her shoulders slumped, the posture of a victim. It felt like putting on a shroud. Elias had a small poke of money from Isaac, enough for a show. They rode, not from the hills, but up the main track, bold as brass. In the middle of the afternoon, Elias as Mr. Stone, a buyer from Texas, and Rosalie as Anne, his quiet, worn-out woman. The guards at the gate were suspicious, their rifles held ready. "I'm here to see the Baron," Elias announced, his voice a low, confident boom. He didn't sound like a man asking. He sounded like a man who expected to be obeyed. "The name is Stone. I'm given to understand he and I have similar business interests." He gestured dismissively, over his shoulder at Rosalie. "And I'm in the market for new stock." The ugly words hung in the air. The guards looked at Rosalie, who kept her eyes on the ground, trembling just enough. They saw her slumped posture, her dirt-smudged face. They saw a woman who was owned. They understood. One of them nodded, and the heavy gate swung open. Rosalie felt her heart hammer against her ribs so hard she thought she might be sick. She was inside. She was back. They were told to wait on the wide, shaded veranda. A servant, a young girl with the same dead eyes Rosalie remembered having, brought them water and said the Baron would see them shortly. And then he appeared, Baron Vance. He was not a big man, but he filled the doorway. He was dressed in a silk waistcoat and a fine wool suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He smelled of expensive tobacco and bay rum. He smiled, a thin, polite expression that never reached his cold, blue eyes. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice smooth. "A pleasure. I was not aware I was expecting you." "A man of your reputation needs no appointment," Elias said, his voice just as smooth. He stood up, but did not offer his hand. His left arm was held stiffly at his side, as if from an old injury. "I'm passing through from Texas, expanding my holdings. One hears rumors that you are a man who can procure quality indentures, long-term, without the usual bureaucratic fuss." Vance's smile widened. Just slightly, he understood. "I am a man of business, Mr. Stone. I find solutions." His gaze flickered to Rosalie, a quick, appraising look, like a man judging livestock. "Your companion?" "My wife, Anne," Elias said, the word a lie. "A good worker, but she's lost her spirit. I'm looking for something new, something with a bit of fire left, something to last the long winters." Rosalie flinched, as if he had struck her. It was a perfect piece of acting. Vance chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Yes, fire. It's a tiresome thing to break, but so satisfying, is it not?" He gestured to the open door. "Come into my study. We'll discuss what you're looking for. Perhaps a brandy." "I would like that," Elias said. Rosalie's nightmare truly began as she stepped over the threshold. The house smelled. It was the same smell. A sickening mix of lemon oil wax, old cigar smoke, and the faint, sweet perfume Vance insisted the girls wear. Her stomach churned. She saw the grand staircase she had been forced to scrub on her hands and knees. She saw the heavy oak door to the dining room, where she had been made to stand and serve his dinners, silent as a ghost. Every shadow held a memory. Every sound made her want to jump. They entered the study. It was just as she remembered. Dark wood. Shelves filled with books. A massive desk. This was the room where he'd signed the paper that claimed her. This was the room where he'd held her down. "A fine room," Elias said, glancing around. "Now, this brandy." As Vance turned to the decanter, Elias said, "My Anne has a keen eye for accommodations. She worries about cleanliness. Perhaps while we talk, she could see the quarters where you house your charges. It would set her mind at ease." Vance looked at Rosalie, amused. "An excellent idea." He rang a small bell. A guard appeared, a beefy man she didn't recognize. "Clegg," Vance said. "Take Mr. Stone's woman here and show her the women's wing. She's inspecting." Clegg grinned, a gap-toothed, ugly expression, and nodded at Rosalie. "This way, ma'am." Rosalie looked at Elias, her eyes wide with a fresh bolt of panic. They were being separated. This was not the plan. Elias gave her a look so subtle, so quick, she almost missed it. "Stay strong." She bowed her head. "Yes, master," she whispered, and followed Clegg out of the room. The moment the door clicked shut, Elias turned his attention to the desk. He could hear Vance pouring the brandy, talking about the trouble of finding good help. "A beautiful desk, Baron," Elias said, walking over, his good right hand brushing the wood. "Appears to be locked. A man must guard his investments." "Indeed," Vance said, bringing the glasses over. Elias took the glass and fumbled it, spilling the amber liquid all over the front of Vance's expensive waistcoat. "Damn!" Elias cursed. "My clumsy arm! My apologies, Baron. That was unforgivable." Vance sputtered, brushing at the stain, his polite facade cracking. No, it's quite all right. A trifle." "Let me get a cloth," Elias said, moving past him, back toward the desk, where he'd seen a stack of papers. He looked for a cloth, and in that split second, his good hand slipped a thin, wicked-looking lockpick from his sleeve. Another gift from Isaac. His back was to Vance. He inserted it into the drawer lock, the one Rosalie had told him about. "Don't trouble yourself, Mr. Stone. I'll ring for a—" Elias turned, a clean cloth in his hand, which he'd palmed from his pocket. "Here we are. My apologies. This old injury—" He dabbed at Vance's coat. His other hand, behind his back, twisting the pick. The lock clicked, a sound lost as he spoke. He had it. He pulled the drawer open a bare inch. Meanwhile, Rosalie was walking down a long, dark hall. Her heart was a cold stone. This was the wing. She could hear a low murmur of voices from behind a locked door. Clegg, the guard, was walking ahead of her, his boots heavy on the polished floor. As they passed an alcove, a second guard stepped out, a man carrying a tray. He was older, grizzled, and he stopped when he saw Clegg. "Who's this?" "Mr. Stone's woman, the new buyer. She's inspecting," Clegg said, sneering. The grizzled guard's eyes fell on Rosalie. She kept her head down, her hair falling to hide her face. But he didn't move. He squinted, stepping closer. Rosalie's blood ran cold. She knew that squint. She knew that scar on his chin. His name was Hackett. He was the one who had held her down. "Wait a minute," Hackett said, his voice a low growl. He pushed her hair back from her face. Rosalie froze, her eyes meeting his. Hackett's eyes went wide. His jaw dropped. "I'll be damned," he breathed. "It's you, the runaway, Rosalie." In that instant, all the fear, all the planning, all the acting, it all burned away. There was only the white-hot rage. As Hackett grabbed for her, she didn't scream. She acted. She brought her knee up, hard, driving it into his groin with all her strength. He gasped, a high, wheezing sound, and dropped the tray, his hands flying to his crotch. Clegg, the other guard, cursed and drew his gun. "Witch!" Rosalie dove for the fallen tray. Grabbing a heavy pewter pitcher, Clegg fired, the shot exploding in the narrow hall, the bullet splintering the wood where she had just been. "Elias!" she screamed, her voice a raw sound of war. In the study, at the sound of the shot, Elias didn't hesitate. He kicked the desk chair into Vance, who toppled backward. Elias ripped the desk drawer open, grabbed the thick, bound ledgers, and shoved them inside his coat. "What is the meaning of this?" Vance roared from the floor. Elias drew his Schofield. "The meaning," he said, "is that your property is here to collect its debt." He heard Rosalie scream his name again. He burst from the study, his revolver up. He saw her, backed into the alcove. Clegg advancing on her, his gun raised. Hackett was still on his knees, gasping. Elias fired. His right arm was steady. The shot took Clegg in the chest. He staggered, looked down in surprise, and fell. Hackett, recovering, looked up and saw Elias. He lunged, not for his gun, but for Rosalie, grabbing her, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Drop it, Boone!" he spat. He didn't know Elias's name. He just said, "Drop it! Drop the gun, or she gets it." "The ledgers!" Rosalie cried, struggling in Hackett's grip. "Got him!" Elias yelled, his gun still steady, looking for a shot. "The plan! Rosalie, the plan!" She knew what he meant. If it went wrong, burn it. She looked at the wall beside her. A large, ornate oil lamp hung there, its flame burning bright, with a desperate animal strength. She slammed her head back into Hackett's face, His nose broke with a wet, crunching sound, and he howled, his grip loosening just enough. It was all she needed. She ripped the lamp from the wall, hot oil spilling, and threw it at the heavy velvet curtains that covered the hallway window. The fire was instant, an explosion of flame. The old, dry fabric went up like tinder. "Fire!" a voice shrieked from down the hall. In the chaos, Elias fired again. The shot went wide as Hackett ducked, dragging Rosalie. Alarms were ringing. Men were shouting. The hall was filling with thick, black smoke. "The stable!" Elias yelled. Grabbing Rosalie's hand, he fired 2 more shots down the hall to keep the guards back, then dragged her toward the foyer. The fire was already spreading, licking at the ceiling. Hungry. They burst out the front doors, choking into the clean afternoon air. The front of the house was in chaos. Men were running from the barns, from the barracks, staring in disbelief at the smoke pouring from the windows. Their horses were still at the hitching post, rearing in panic. Get on!" Elias roared. Untying the reins with one hand, he shoved Rosalie toward her horse. A shot rang out from the porch. Baron Vance was standing there, his face purple with rage, a small pistol in his hand. "You'll hang for this, both of you!" Elias fired back, the bullet chipping the stone by Vance's head, forcing him back inside. "Let's ride!" They mounted, digging their heels into the horses' flanks. They galloped toward the main gate, which was now being closed by 2 frantic guards. "Don't stop!" Elias yelled. But Rosalie did. She reined in, halfway across the yard. "Rosalie, what are you doing?" he screamed, pulling his own horse to a stop. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the burning house. A piece of the front porch, a carved wooden post, was burning fiercely. She rode her horse right up to it, the heat scorching her face. She reached out, grabbed a piece of the burning timber, a makeshift torch. "Rosalie, they're closing the gate!" "One more thing," she said, her voice a low, terrible growl. She wheeled her horse, her face a mask of smoke and fury. She galloped, not to the gate, but to the huge, arrogant sign that stood beside it. "Vance Estate," it read. "Private property." She rode right up to it, with a scream that came from the very bottom of her soul. She pulled her torn shirt collar aside, exposing the puckered, ugly brand on her shoulder to the daylight, to the eyes of the guards, to the world, and she thrust the torch into the dry wood of the sign. It caught instantly. She sat there for one long, perfect second, framed against the burning house, the burning sign, her brand exposed, her face a terrifying vision of justice. "Now!" she screamed, and wheeled the horse. They galloped through the gates, scattering the guards, who were too stunned to even shoot. They rode hard, leaving the chaos, the shouting, and the pillar of black smoke behind them. They didn't stop. They rode until the horses were slick with sweat, until the sun had set, until the only sign of the Vance estate was a faint, angry red glow on the far horizon. They pushed on, into the deep, dark wilderness, putting as many miles as they could between them and that place. Finally, in a deep wash, hours later, Elias pulled his horse to a halt. "We rest," he panted, sliding from the saddle, his wounded arm a dead, throbbing weight. Rosalie fell more than dismounted. Her legs gave out, and she sat on the cold sand, her body shaking so violently she could barely breathe. It was over. She was out. They had the ledgers. And she began to weep. It was not the small, terrified crying of the cabin. It was a storm, a deep, wrenching, ragged sobbing that tore from her chest, the sound of years of terror and pain and shame finally breaking free. Elias, wincing, knelt beside her. He was in agony, but he reached for his bedroll and pulled out the blanket. He didn't speak. He just wrapped it around her shaking shoulders, pulling her against his good right side, his arm holding her tight. They sat there for a long, long time, the only sound her sobbing and the ragged breathing of the horses. The red glow on the horizon faded to black. Her tears finally subsided, leaving her exhausted, her breath hitching in the cold night air. She leaned her head against his good shoulder. "I never thought," she whispered, her voice broken. "I never thought I would walk away alive." "You didn't just walk away, Rosalie," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and pride. He looked down at her, his face grim in the starlight. "You rode out, and you left your mark this time." He gently, so gently, touched his fingers to her shoulder, over the thick wool of the blanket, right where he knew the brand was. "That brand?" he said, his voice low and certain. "That's not who you are anymore, but I'll carry it with you. Always." They didn't ride back to Isaac's. It was too dangerous. They assumed Merritt, or what was left of Vance's men, would be watching the known routes, watching for Elias's known friends. They traveled for 2 weeks, a long, looping circle through the territory, avoiding every town, every major trail. Elias's shoulder healed slow and hard, a stiff, aching reminder of the fight. But he never complained. And Rosalie, she tended to him with a quiet, fierce efficiency, her hands no longer shaking. The terror that had lived in her gut for so long had been burned out, leaving behind a cold, clear calm. They finally made their way to Prescott, coming in from the north, looking like any other pair of trail-worn drifters. Elias, his arm in a sling he'd made from a blanket, looked pale but determined. Rosalie, dressed in the rough canvas trousers and shirt, her hair cut short, could have passed for a boy if you didn't look too close. "They didn't go to the sheriff." Elias knew better. As Isaac had said, men like Vance owned the local law. Instead, they went to the small, dusty office of the territorial newspaper, the Arizona Miner. Elias walked in alone, leaving Rosalie outside with the horses, her hand resting near the butt of the rifle she now carried as if it were part of her. He walked up to the editor, a small, ink-stained man with wire-rimmed spectacles, and dropped the heavy, smoke-stained ledgers on his desk. "You're a man who likes a story," Elias said, his voice low. "This one's about Baron Vance. It's all in there. Names, dates, contracts, proof of him buying and selling women like cattle, proof of illegal indentures. Girls kept as slaves long past any legal age." The editor's eyes went wide. He opened the first ledger, his fingers tracing the neat columns of names. He looked up at Elias, his expression a mix of fear and journalistic hunger. This is dynamite. This could get a man killed, printing this." "It's already gotten men killed, not printing it," Elias said, his good hand resting on his revolver. "You print it. You print the truth. Or I'll take these to your competitor in Phoenix. Your choice." The editor, seeing the cold, hard look in Elias's eyes, and smelling the biggest story of his career, swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll print it." Elias and Rosalie were gone before the sun set, riding north, finally, toward Idaho. They didn't leave a firestorm behind them. The world, Elias knew, didn't work like that. Justice was a slow, muddy creek, not a flash flood. But the story ran. It was short, buried on the 3rd page, carefully worded to avoid a libel suit. Irregularities discovered in territorial contracts. Illegal indentures investigated in Canyon Country. It spoke of ledgers, found and turned over by an anonymous source. It mentioned that a woman, instrumental in the investigation, had provided testimony. It was enough. The contracts were a federal matter, and the quiet pressure from Washington, spurred by the newspaper's story, forced the territorial marshal to act. Baron Vance himself was too rich, too insulated, to be touched. He claimed the ledgers were forgeries, that he'd been robbed by a disgruntled former hand, but 2 of his key men, including the foreman Clegg, who, it turned out, hadn't died in the hall but had been dragged out, wounded, were arrested. Hackett, the guard who had recognized Rosalie, was found dead, his neck broken in the fire. The estate didn't fall, but it was crippled, The flow of indentures stopped. The power Vance had wielded so openly was forced back into the shadows. It was not a total victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The hive had been kicked over, and the wasps were scattered. Rosalie never knew most of this. She refused to be named, refused to be a part of it. When Elias told her, weeks later, what he'd heard from a traveler, she just nodded. She didn't want justice anymore. She just wanted peace. The ride north was long. It took them the better part of 2 months. They crossed the high desert, forded the great, wide rivers, and climbed into the sharp, pine-scented mountains of the Idaho Territory. It was a new world. The air was cleaner, the water was colder, and the land was empty, waiting. They found their piece of it in a high valley, a small, hard parcel of land nobody else wanted. It had a creek, a stand of good timber, and a meadow that was more rock than soil. But it was theirs. They paid for it with the last of the money from Isaac, and the gold Elias had kept hidden in his saddlebags. And they began to build their life, which had been defined by running and fighting and fire, now became a life of simple, hard, repetitive tasks. They built their home with their own hands. Elias, his shoulder still healing, could only work with one good arm. So Rosalie became his other. She learned to swing an axe, to notch the logs, to mix the mud for the chinking. He would hold the log steady, and she would drive the spike. They worked from sunup to sundown, side by side, in a quiet, shared rhythm. They hammered fence posts into the rocky soil, a jarring, thankless job. They cleared stones from the meadow, piling them one by one into a long, low wall. They planted seeds for a small garden, their fingers digging in the cold, dark earth. They were building a home, but they were also building a new life, a new way of being. The silence that had once been filled with fear and tension was now filled with the comfortable, easy quiet of two people who knew each other's every move. He'd bring her a cup of water without her asking. She'd have his plate of food ready when he came in from checking the horse. They were two halves of a whole, scarred and imperfect, but fitting together just right. As their cabin took shape, the few other families in the valley, other homesteaders, farmers, trappers, slowly began to make themselves known. They were quiet folk, respectful of privacy, but they'd stop by offering a bushel of potatoes or help raising a roof beam. They saw in Rosalie a quiet, strong woman. They saw the scar on her shoulder. She didn't hide it anymore. Not when she was working in the sun, but they didn't ask. Folks out here, they all had scars of one kind or another. It wasn't polite to ask how they got them. It was Rosalie who found her new name, as she called it. The families in the valley were poor. Their children ran wild, bright and strong, but ignorant. Rosalie, who had been taught to read and write by her mother, saw a need. She started small, inviting two of the nearest children into her cabin one afternoon, showing them the letters in an old almanac. Word spread. Within a few months, she was teaching, every afternoon, a half-dozen children, from tow-headed 4-year-olds to lanky 10-year-olds, would gather on her porch, and she would teach them their letters, their numbers. Elias would sit on the woodpile, sharpening his axe, and watch her. He saw a light in her face he had never seen before. The hunted look was gone. The hardened look of the fighter was gone. This was something new. She was patient. She was kind. And when she smiled at a child who finally spelled a word, her whole face lit up. She was no longer Rosalie the runaway, or Rosalie the branded. She was Ma'am, the teacher, and in that quiet, simple work, she found a peace that all the fire and vengeance in the world could not have given her. One night, late in the summer, they were sitting outside their finished cabin. The hard work of the day was done. A cool breeze moved down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine. The sky was a vast, deep black, littered with so many stars it looked like spilled diamonds. They sat in silence for a long time, just breathing the air, existing in the peace they had built. Rosalie, who was leaning her head back against his good shoulder, finally spoke, her voice soft in the darkness. "Elias?" "I'm here." "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice a murmur. "Why did you stay? That day in the wash, you could have given me water and ridden on. Any other man would have. Why did you stay through all of it? The trackers, the bullet, Merritt. Why?" Elias looked up at the stars, thinking back to that day, to the bundle of rags and fear he'd found huddled behind the rock. He remembered the fever, and the moment he'd pulled the torn cloth aside. "Because the minute I saw that mark," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble, "the minute I saw that brand on your shoulder, I knew I'd never walk away from you. I reckon I saw my own scars, on your skin. And I knew, right then, that my fight and your fight, they were the same one." She was quiet for a moment. Then she took his calloused hand, the one that had taught her to shoot, the one that had held her in the rain, and she pressed it, flat, against her left shoulder, over the front of her simple dress, right over the place where the scar lay beneath. His hand was warm, and it covered the brand completely. "Then promise me something," she whispered, her voice thick. "Anything," he said. She held his hand there, tight, as if anchoring him to her. "Promise me this'll be the last mark I ever carry. Promise me this is the last one." Elias turned, his body shifting. He leaned in, his face close to hers, his eyes dark and tender in the starlight. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of peace and forever. Then he moved his lips from hers, and he kissed her neck, and then her collarbone, and then, gently, through the rough cloth of her dress, he pressed a kiss right over the scar. He lifted his head, his hand still covering the brand, his gaze holding hers. "No," he whispered, his voice a raw, unbreakable vow. "This won't be your last." She stiffened, a flicker of the old fear, but he held her gaze, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "But it'll be the only one that means forever. Thank you kindly for listening to our story. We'd sure love to hear your thoughts, and where in the world you're tuning in from, so you all can connect with each other. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share what's on your mind."